Artifact Patch 1.2 has been really warmly received by the community in general, and while I'm personally really excited about the balance changes in the progression system, I think that this represents a fundamental change in the philosophy of Valve and how they're managing the game, which is something that I'm very excited about. In order to talk about this though, I want to go back to the beginning of the history of card games and talk a little bit about the dichotomy between the collectors versus the gamers. After Magic's release in 1993, it ended up being a smash hit right out the gates, which led to this roller coaster few years with lots of changes. People loved the game, it was growing rapidly, but Wizards had a hard time keeping up with the demand and was worried that new players wouldn't have access to the old cards that had been released before, especially given the low print numbers. One of the strategies they did in order to do this was release a lot of reprints, and in 1995 they actually released 2 sets that were entirely reprints of older cards. 4th edition and Chronicles. They had some reprints before, but the scale of this was kind of new. This was great for getting older cards into the hands of newer players, but the market of these cards really dipped down quite a lot as the supply had been so greatly increased. As you can imagine, the collector community was very unhappy about this, and they were really worried that WotC would just continually release new reprints of these cards that they had been investing in and always kind of crushing their investment, which made it very hard for them to feel secure in actually investing into the game. This left Wizards in a pinch. As a game, you want players to have access to your cards, and the more cards they have access to, the better. At the same time, these cards were also a collectible, meaning that rarity and exclusivity should mean something. In this case, Wizards solved the problem by creating the Reserved List, which is a selection of cards that were promised to never reprint. This was a controversial move at the time and is still controversial now, over 20 years after the original decision. Still, this was the compromise that they made to give the confidence to collectors that Magic was both a game and an investment. Flash forward to March 2018. Gabe Newell is giving a presentation about Artifact to some gaming journalists who are really learning the details about the game for the first time. Let's take a look.
The original Magic the Gathering players typically were spending about $400 a year on cards, right? That's just kind of a concrete number. So when you think of the fact that people are acquiring assets, right, you start to worry when you think of these things the way we've learned to think about them. How do you preserve that value, right? You don't want people to say, I've accumulated a bunch of assets and they're constantly being depreciated. I don't want to find out that the cards have gone to zero value because of some design decision you've made or because I can't exchange them for other people. So a market is one way of increasing the value of an asset. In nerdy terms, there's a liquidity premium that are associated with that assets.
So Gabe seems to be taking a similar line to what Wizards was taking philosophically back in 1995, where cards should both retain their value and be game pieces. And you see even on the slide there that line that cards should hold their value. Let's also take a look at an interview that happened with the Artifact design team with Game Informer around that same time. Game Informer. One of the things I saw with Dota is that you're planning to balance more regularly. Is that the approach you're taking to Artifact in terms of having more regular updates? Jeep Barnett. We have a long history of partnering with our community and making sure we're building the thing that best serves that community. Scaff Elias. Our intention is to update it primarily releasing new cards. Richard Garfield. It is worth noting that we will nerf and buff cards at an absolute minimum. We probably would never buff a card. Scaff Elias. There's never a reason to buff a card. Richard Garfield. The only reason to nerf a card is the unlikely situation where everyone has to play this card or they'll lose. We would rather let the metagame play out, and if a card is a problem, it's going to go away anyway. So in the spring, it seemed that Valve felt the best way to approach managing Artifact was to have as few balance changes as possible. This would create a healthy economy where cards retain their value, and at the same time, balance changes could be more or less handled through releasing new cards. as of yesterday, things have clearly changed. Not only are we seeing nerfs to both Axe and Drow Ranger, we even saw buffs to Lion and Bloodseeker. Less than a month after release, and we're already past the world of we would probably never buff a card. In all the excitement about specific card changes, I think that people might not appreciate how big of a philosophical change this represents. It's also worth emphasizing, the constructed metagame was, in my opinion, pretty okay. It wasn't like we had a one-deck metagame where everybody was playing a red-green deck that was playing Axe and Drow. I mean, sure, that's playable, and there's a lot of decks that play either Axe or Drow that are playable, but there were even some decks you could play that didn't play either of those cards. So, like, it wasn't like the game was totally solved and totally stagnant. They decided, though, to change it anyway because they felt that they could improve the fun of the game by reducing some of the power level of these peak cards, but this also then throws the market into pretty big disarray, so that's a significant cost. This also relates to the progression system that was announced yesterday. It used to be the case that you would buy an account for $20. This gave you 10 packs worth of value, which is a fair exchange. Now you're also getting access to 15 packs and 15 tickets worth of value that are given to you through the progression system, which greatly increases the value of those accounts. Now, this doesn't suddenly create value to you that you're able to sell these cards for a bunch of extra money, but what it does do is it actually adds to the supply in the economy, which causes the downstream implication of reducing the cost of various cards. Both Axe and Drow lost a lot of value right after the announcement hit, as one might expect. A lot of that came back in the last 12 hours or so, but overall we see the economy has been really volatile since the announcement. So this is what I'm talking about. This is what happens when you both have these balance changes and a huge increase in supply that's available to the economy. You're going to expect to see these big disruptions in prices. This gets back to the fundamental question of trading card games. Are these cards investments or are they just game pieces? Back in '95, the decision of Wizards of the Coast to create the reserve list seemed to try to decide that they were both an investment and a game piece. But now I think that we're seeing that Valve is taking a very different tact. It's pretty clear from patch 1.2 that they see these as primarily a game piece and not an investment. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that it's impossible to make money off of managing your accounts correctly in Artifact. In fact, if you had been somebody who was really attentive over the last 48 hours, you actually could have made a reasonable amount of money off of buying and selling Axe and Drow at their strategic times. But what this really indicates is that a long-term investment of buying into cards and having them appreciate in value over months and years, that's probably not going to be a particularly bright strategy, given what we've seen here in Valve's attempt at balancing the metagame and the chaos that's caused in the market, and the suggestion that we might not see that value retain over the long term. That's good for us who are the most focused on the gameplay and less interested in the collecting side of things, but it is quite the trade-off, and there are going to be some people who are unhappy about this. Maybe things change once cosmetics become part of the game, and then there's some exclusive rarities that go on with this. Hard to know how that'll be implemented exactly, but I think that this is a reflection that Valve thinks about Artifact as a game and not as an investment, and that has some very radical implications of how the game will progress and be managed moving forward, and I'm very excited to see how that plays out. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you liked this video, be sure to like, sub, and share. I also have a podcast that I'm doing and hopefully talking about the rest of the stuff that's going on in the patch there very soon, so check that out once it drops. You can also find me on social media. There's links to that below. This video is also brought to you in part by Ink Gaming, a wonderful place to get all sorts of custom gaming supplies with custom designs on them. Be sure to check them out, and you can get yourself a holiday gift there, and you can use the code ASPACE12 to save 12% off your order. Thank you once again for joining me today. Take care, everybody.